Well, I did. The only thing that happened is that to start at Fat Tuesdays, okay, and that'll give you an idea of exactly what's happened. After I had heart surgery, and
Yes,
after
I
the
know.
heart surgery, I found out that I had arthritis real bad. I knew I had it, but I didn't know I had it that bad
In the hands?
in the hands everywhere. And so I decided that what I would do is the doctor's saying that I won't be able to bend my.
Playing with three fingers on the.
Well,
What am I
I'll
asking
show
you?
you. I'll
Yeah.
show you. Just
That's amazing.
it is. It's amazing.
And where are you playing? I say you're playing clubs. And
Fat Tuesdays.
You're playing that
every
Fat
Monday
Tuesday?
night.
Yeah. That's
So I
wonderful.
took that job, and over a period of time, hoping the audience would. I didn't explain it to the audience. I just did it. Hope that the audience would bear with me till I learned to play the new way. And the audience didn't know from
They didn't know there was only three things.
that they didn't.
Do you videotape all the shows?
No, these are all audio. We
Oh,
were
those are audio tapes.
videotaping.
Yeah.
These are videotapes. You
Yes.
do it all on videotape.
Yeah, but you're taping audio only.
Taping audio only.
Yeah.
And so what happened is that I just audio taped it on cassettes for the first 2.5 years. And when I figured now I'm getting to play the shit out of this guitar, now I think I'll go to work. So now I brought down the engineers and the digital stuff and started to lay down the stuff for Blood.
How many people are you playing with there? Is it,
I have a trio, just a guitar and a bass,
and you play every Monday night?
every Monday night. Now this, I'm getting to Joe Bushkin.
Yeah.
So everybody's down there. So Monty Alexander's down there, so Frank Owens is down there, and Hank Jones is down there, and Johnny Bush is down there, and they're all there.
You mean they're just hanging out, or
Well, they all come down to hang out.
They play a little bit
They
too?
play a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So I set up the piano there and set up an extra guitar. So when Johnny Smith walks in, or Chet Atkins walks in, or any of the guitar players, Pat Martino, George Benson, they all come down.
Yeah.
So every guitar player that I know, a man, has been down there, and they all sit
No
in. So
kidding.
the Jimmy Page sits in,
Wow.
and Mark Knopfler. It just goes on and on with rock guitar players and jazz guitar
Are
players.
you playing this Monday night too? or-
Yeah, every Monday night. And every Monday night, practically every Monday night, I don't want to say every Monday night, because last Monday night one didn't sit in, but the week before that was, I have to think back, there's so damn many that
Wow.
come in.
Well, you mentioned.
Okay,
you mentioned
so
who's who.
yeah, so they just come in there by the Grove. So one night in walks Joe Bushkin. Joe says, "I'm coming back into business again. I'm going to make an album." And I said, "Geez, that's great, Joe." And he says, "I says, where are you going to make it?" And he says, "I figured I'd go over to NOLA." And I says, "Jesus Christ almighty, Joe, you can't make an album over at NOLA." I says, "God, they went out with button shoes. That's real. You can do better than that." I said, "Why don't you go to the power station?" Something like that. Well, he says, "I don't have a producer yet, and I got to get a producer and everything." And he says, "I'll take heed to what you said, you know." So he come back in there the next Monday night. He sat in, he's playing some stuff, and we're knocking it off pretty good. And I said, "How you doing with your album?" And he says, "Well," he says, "You're right, NOLA is not so hot, but I just can't find a place where the piano is right," and so on, so on, so on, so on. I said, "Well, I got a studio. I haven't done an outside date." I said, "I only do my own stuff there." And I said, "Since 1980, I haven't." I says, we tore out all the old equipment." I says, "It's going into into the Smithsonian Institute. Now you realize this is like a year ago. So he says, can I do it out at your place? And I said, what do you intend to do? He says, I don't know. And I says, what material have you got? So he told me what he had, and I says, is it written out? And he says, no, but the guys in the group know it. But he says, I thought, you know, maybe you'd produce it. And I said, well, I said, okay, I'll produce the damn thing, you know. So we got together on what it would cost him and me as a producer, and to rent the studios and everything else. And he says, okay. I got the guys with the bread and we'll do it. So I said, well, we'll fly over to Berlin or Hamburg, wherever, and do the fiddles, do the strings. And that was the understanding. So when we just finished putting that board in. So I looked the board over and everything else, so I called in my two sons, they're both engineers, and said, look, I'm not going to engineer the date, I'm going to produce the date. Now, I've produced a lot of dates, but I've never produced an outside date. So I said, Jesus Christ, this is going to be a ball. I'll have a lot of fun doing this. So I figured out just what he had, so forth and so on. Figured, all right, I'm going to do this one the way I did it in the garage out in California, like when I first went to Capitol Records. So I went all the way back. Said, I'm going to use, I've been thinking about this a long time. I'm not going to use the microphones they're using today because I hate their mics. Now there's some great mics out there, but I'm talking about the typical run-of-the-mill now. They're using microphones. They, meaning most of the industry,
Yes.
are using microphones that were made to fit the music, the rock and roll music of today. Did you eat, by the way?
Yeah, I've eaten. So
You
go
did
right
eat?
ahead. Yeah, you go right ahead and eat, yeah.
Because you want some oatmeal,
No,
you got some
No,
oatmeal.
thank you. I just had lunch before we came.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, you go.
So I'm not boring you with this
No,
stuff.
no, no,
Okay.
no.
So what happened is that I said to my two kids, Gene and Russ, I said, hey, and a couple other engineers and assistants that were here, I said, I'm going to do this different than what you're used to doing. He says, I want you to dig out all the goddamn old mics. I want you to dig out all the ribbon mics.
They could find them?
Yeah, they could find them.
Yeah.
I haven't used them since the Hollywood days out there. I knew what a great mic they were. And I'd worked the mics over. Over the years,
Yeah.
I'd found how to update the mics, which I'd done, put all new ribbons in them and so forth and so on. So this would make a lot of guys happy at Capitol that are long gone. But they would crack up because it's so ridiculous. So instead of having a mic like you're looking at, like I'm looking at here, no, they use these great big old bastards, right? So person knows nothing about mics. So whatever you put in front of him,
He's just going to play the
The other-
session.
but the musicians kind of look at it and say, Jesus. One guy, I heard him say, it was 1934 since I saw a mic like this when I first came to New York. Another guy says, why in the hell is he using those? Maybe it's for pictures. So I pressed the button and I says, hey, you guys, we're actually going to use those mics. If they don't work, I says, I got some brand new mics here. And I said, we'll be using those, but I want to try. So we did. In the meantime, my sons are asking me, are you sure what you're doing, Dad? They figured, Christ, I just went right off.
You lost it.
I went left. I made a wrong turn. So I said, that's what I want. It's exactly what I want. The Audio Engineering Society, Record, Reproduce magazine, Mix magazine, almost all of the electronic magazines that I get are all talking about this, what I did. And what they're saying is that we have to reevaluate what we're doing because of digital.
It sounded so good.
It sounded, it's a bitch.
Correct.
It's a bitch.
No kidding.
Yeah. Did you hear the album?
I heard one on the radio. There was a
Yeah.
guy played a cut, and then Joe sent me a tape, and I must admit I played it in the background. He was just telling me what he was doing. I wasn't going to make
Yeah.
a deal with Joe at the point. He was just telling me what he was going to do. He wasn't even looking for it. And I didn't listen carefully, and I didn't even realize you were involved with it because the tape was just a cassette with his own label on it. It wasn't even an Atlantic
It
cassette.
makes a I got it here.
And I just saw the Atlantic record while I was
It
waiting
makes a
for
big
it.
difference.
Yeah.
See, he had Hot Nuts for Erdogan. And I said to him, are you sure you want to give this to Atlantic? Because my son is at Atlantic.
Yes.
Gene, and Gene, he's an engineer there. So I says, Gene, do you think he's right in taking it to Erdogan? He says, I don't think so.
Was it Nestle or Ahmet?
It was Ahmet.
Ahmet, yeah.
So I says, I just don't think that they're the guys that are going to take easy listening music.
No.
That's what this is.
No, they're they're deeply in a rock and roll thing.
They don't even know the stations that
Yeah.
take it to.
Yeah.
I says, the guy who runs with it under his arm, I says, this is absolutely a freak for them.
So nothing really happened or has happened with it as yet?
What happened with the album is it just went to sleep.
Came out and
What I expected
Stillborn.
it to do.
Stillborn, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a shame when
Yeah.
there's so much involved in it and it just drops.
Well, we
out
got to
like
the
this.
strings.
Yeah. Where did you do the strings?
Right here.
Oh, in his studio? In your studio?
So I said, Joe, by now, he says, whatever you say, Les, whatever you say. The album come out so great that now we got to go to strings. And I says, hey, I got it all figured out. So I says, who do you want to do the strings? He says, you know Abe Osler? I says, Christ, I know him real well. I says, the only strings I ever used in my life was with Capitol. And I says, I did those with Andy Wiswell. We did them at 40 whatever street,
Yeah.
6th Street, whatever it is, at Capitol. Then I says, Glenn Osler did the arrangements. I says, he's a bitch. So he says, where do you want to do them? So I says, well, you have them write them up and we'll do them right out here. So my sons come on me again and they says, are you sure, Dad? Jesus, the ceiling's low and this and that. And I says, look, I says, there's going to be no problem.
How many
No.
strings?
8.
8 strings.
That's all.
That's it.
I didn't overdub them or nothing.
Yeah.
So when Glenn come in, I set him up in a horseshoe. And he said, Glenn says, well, we run them down. I says, great. I says, why don't you run one down, make your changes, go to 2 and 3, and then go through all 8 and rehearse all 8, and then we will do them. I think they did 8 out of the 12. 13. I said to Gene, I says, hit the button.
You take the rehearsal?
We taped the rehearsal. So Glenn run them down, and they're out having coffee, and they're going to go back in and do the masters. And so I said to Glenn, it's all finished. We got what we want. He says, it's just a rehearsal, Les. Now, during the rehearsal, I did take and say to him, will you raise that an octave? All right.
So you were playing around during the rehearsal?
Yeah.
Getting what you wanted.
Got the whole thing, and they were done a half hour before the rehearsal. The first half of the session.
Never
After-
before, never again.
It would never happen again. And the fiddle players, the string players were all saying, we've never heard strings sound like that
Through
in our life.
those ribbon microphones.
Yeah, of course, because we had that big, and so one violin player says, geez, he says, you mean to tell me you're going to put that rock right up against my Strat? My Strat? I said, look, I guarantee you it isn't going to fall. And right, here's his violin, right here is the microphone, you know, now close mic, everything like less than 6 inches, 3 inches. And the violin player with this goddamn 44. Joe Bushkin was like this,
Right up
and no mics on the piano. I invented a mic, okay, and I use that on the piano, and it's a bitch. Now I'll just play a couple of the things of the album. The album came out, and it was a killer.
Terrific. And it's too bad it lay there. Though they should do something with it. They should license it to someone or do something like
That's
that.
what last time I saw Joe, I says, what'd you do with that album? And he says, well, I'm trying to get it away from Erdogan
You
now.
can get it back, pay him a royalty on it.
That's what I told him.
Absolutely.
That's what I told him. I says, you know, put this in the, you're in the wrong pew. You're in the right
Mail
church
order.
in the wrong
Do
pew.
mail order, go with another label,
got it.
smaller label, something like that.
You got it.
Because I'm trying to, I have Blue Note. And I got,
You have?
Yeah, Blue Note is one of our labels. We bought Blue
Jesus
Note. And
Christ
so
almighty.
I got Bruce Lundvall running it, kind of, and he's got about 14 active artists. You got Stanley Jordan, Bobby McFerrin,
I
he's
know.
got
I know.
Turrentine, and
He did a date out here.
who?
Lundville.
Lundvall did? No?
Yeah, he didn't pay me.
He didn't pay you?
I got 7 goddamn reels of tape upstairs. I
With
was
who? What
chasing that bastard all over.
What artist?
The saxophone player, Benny. Benny.
How long ago was this?
It was the first date we did out of here.
I mean, a couple of years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, because I
More
just...
than that, I thought he was with Island Records or some other.
Bruce Lundvall?
Yeah.
The tall guy?
I don't know,
used
I
to be
never
at
met him.
CBS? Jeez, that doesn't sound like him.
Yeah, it's him, all right.
He-
There's no question
He's
about
the
it.
president of Manhattan Records, and
He ran off, never paid his date.
wow.
My son chased him around, Gene.
How could that possibly be?
Oh,
Because
it-
he wasn't paying for it, the company was paying for it.
He never paid for it.
No kidding.
I have,
Well, before
it
we
just
leave-
says Benny up there on 2-inch tape,
Okay.
and I just saw it the other day, and I said,
Before I leave, you give me a little rundown on that.
I will.
Let me tell you what I'm here for.
Go ahead.
I'm writing a book. I thought I was going to write. For years, I ran Warner Brothers Records. I was president of Warner Brothers Records.
I know that.
20 years. And then I got out, and I was doing some things with Warner Communications and sports, and people came to me to write a book. Ran them up. And I didn't want to write my own story ain't that interesting, but I thought I'd get people to talk about in our business, like Studs Terkel does. He writes these books about oral histories. Well, I've now done 225 interviews. I started with the big band guys. I've got Artie Shaw, I got Woody, I've had
Right.
Lionel Hampton, I've had Cy Oliver, Les Brown, Buddy Rich.
Great.
I've had Rosie Clooney, Frankie Lane, Frank Sinatra. I've had Sammy Kahn and Sammy Fain and Burt Bacharach and Hank Mancini. I've had Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney and Jan and Dean and the Beach Boys. And I've done
They all
Billy
come down there, too.
Yeah,
Beach Boys
yeah,
down there.
so I've done 225 interviews. This book is coming out next year, and
Should
it's
be
just kind of talking about how it was, any stories about what it was, and I'll ask you a few questions, and
Yeah.
it would just go. I did,
Perfect.
and yesterday I did Ahmet Ertegun. I did 2 hours. What stories, Les? What stories that guy has about
Oh.
Ray Charles
Yeah.
and Big Joe Turner and Mick Jagger and Eric Clapton and great stories. And Ahmet, they're going to celebrate the 40th year of that company. My God, he has been with that for 40 years. He started it while he was in college, Atlantic Records, as a little kibitz, something to do, and then he was going to take his PhD and go back to Turkey.
Erdogan and Joey Wexler and all.
Erdogan. Then he brought in Wexler. Then he brought his brother Nesui in.
Yeah.
And they've 40 years. And we were partners with them because we bought them. 1968, Warner Brothers bought Atlantic. And so
Yeah, I know.
I was partners with those guys and we made this one of the great record companies in the world, Warner or Atlantic, and we bought Elektra
That's
Records. And but I interviewed him yesterday, and it was a fascinating interview. And but I've done some great interviews, Bob
Yeah.
Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and Herbie Hancock and Stan Getz and Dave Brubeck, Chet Baker.
I work. That's Fat Tuesdays is with Steve Getz.
Steve Getz, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Stan is just had an operation, and he claims
I
he's
know.
okay, and
I
so
know.
forth. I'm just going to ask you some questions.
Okay, you just fire
and
away.
you just talk away. When you started playing guitar, what did you think you were going to be? Just a session guitarist, or
No.
go out and sing with it,
No.
or what was going to be?
Just what I am.
I mean, a guy who was going to
Exactly.
go technically.
Well, I didn't know how technically I was going to go. But I knew. Joey asked a question nobody's ever asked me.
Yeah.
And the answer I gave you very fast.
Yes.
No, I knew exactly where I was going. When I was like 9, 10 years old, I'd already made up my mind where I was going to go and how I was going to do it.
How come? Was the family in music at all? Or?
No, family wasn't in music. From the time I started playing, I said, I know what I want to do. So I played a harmonica and a guitar, and I was a country singer. And I knew that one day I would become a top country artist.
That's what it was going to be.
That's what it was going to be. So I struck out of Waukesha, Wisconsin at 13 years old. When
Did
I
you have any role models out there?
Oh yeah. The first one to come to Waukesha that floored me was Gene Autry. And when Gene Autry appeared at the Auditorium Theater in Waukesha, I had another guy sit there with a flashlight, and he turned the light on my paper, and I had the fingerboard all drawn out. And when he played a chord, I put the dot there with one finger. And then I'd have to wait until he played F again and put another finger down. And I'd put the dots in, and the light goes on and off and on and off. And Gene Autry, after about the fifth show, he says, I just have to stop the show. He says, folks, but he says, there's something that's bothering me or intriguing me. He says, every time I hit this chord, the light goes on the audience. He says, I can't figure this out at all. And so he says, can you tell me what's going on out there? So I says, Mr. Autry, would you mind playing that chord again? And I says, I'm trying to write down where you put your fingers. So he called me up on the stage. So I went up on the stage, and here I am, this little skinny little kid, and he laughed about it, and he handed me his guitar. And I took the guitar, and he says, play something. And so I did. And he made some comment or something like that, because it brought the house down. It was one of those things, you know, the little hometown boy. And let's say I was about 11, 12, you know, at that time. And he showed me the chords and took me in the back room, and he says, when you get ready, you just come down and I'll take care of you down in Chicago, so forth and so on. Well, what happened is at the age 13, a country and a Western band came through my hometown. And I worked at night. Even at that age, I worked all night. And slept, well, I was going to school at that time, so I had to sleep when I get home in the afternoon. But I was a night worker. And I would be up all night working with these electronics and practicing the guitar.
Were you a prodigy? I mean, do people think you were this boy genius?
Well, my brother thought I was real weird.
Yeah.
My father had divorced and left home. And my mother thought I was a genius. So that was where how I was brought up. I was brought up where I could do no wrong as far as my mother was concerned. She somehow justified whatever I did. If I tore the piano apart, it was for a reason. And look at him. He wants to know why. Well, my brother would go over and throw the light on, and if it didn't light, he would call an electrician. He wouldn't change the bulb. He never figured out why that switch was there, except that if you don't throw it, the light don't go on.
Once you struck out and you left Wisconsin, was it hard? Was it a tough?
Well, the very first time I left, they picked me up right in front of my door. I was just going to say there that I had a string tied to my toe, and it was on a spool of thread, and I threw it out the window, and I always did that in case of an emergency. And my friends, if there was a reason to pull that cord, it was because it had to be mighty important, otherwise don't wake me up. And they woke me up, and Harold Vinger says, there's a band out of Genesee, 9 miles out of town. And he says, the guitar player there, he says, is frightening. He's playing beyond the 3rd fret. And I says, there's nothing up there. He says, to hell there isn't. He says, this guy's going all the way up the fingerboard. At that time, I figured only the frets are just on there to make the guitar look good. It was cosmetic. So he drove me out there with my guitar and harmonica out to Genesee. I couldn't get in, so they lifted me in through the men's room window. And I hear this cowboy band. And when I heard him play, and I saw the guitar player playing all this guitar, and he was an excellent guitar player. Still is. He's alive today.
Who was?
His name is Joe Wolverton. He lives in Arizona. He's 82 years old. And so anyway, I stared at Joe, and Joe says, obviously you're a guitar player. He says, yeah, you haven't taken your eyes off of me. And he says, come on over here, kid. So I come over, and during intermission, he says, here, play me something. So I played him something. So he says, you think you could do this? And he played a run and went all the way up the board, and my mouth is open. He says, I'll be back here next Friday and Saturday. He says, will you learn this? And so he took a envelope, and he drew out the chord changes and so forth and so on. When he came back next week, I had him. So he says, boy, you sure learned that in a hurry. He says, next week we're going to be in Calhoun, which is 9 miles the other side of Waukesha. And I learned those. The leader of the band said, what's your name? And oddly enough, I got this shirt Monday night. No, not this shirt, another shirt. It's in the other one. It says, Rhubarb Red Lives. Someone brought it down to Fat Tuesdays for me. And he says, what's your name? And I says, Red Hot Red. And he says, would you like to do something on the show? I said, I'd love to. And so they had me stand on a chair, and I performed. And they left town, come back the following week. Now, that's 4 weeks in a row that they played the weekends near Waukesha. At the end of that 4th time around, the boss said to me, would you like to join the band? I says, okay. I says, what do you pay? And we're standing outside of this Pierce Cerro with the horns on it and the whole thing. Now I'm talking about deer horns, okay, cow horns, steer horns. And he says, how about $8? And I says, gee, they do better than that right here in Waukesha. Well, he says, I'll go the whole way. I'll go 10. That's as much as I pay anybody in the band. You'd be the highest paid guy in the band. If I went any higher than that, I'm not going to go any higher than that. So I still have to talk to my mom. Talk to my mom. My mom says, well, it's summer vacation and you can come back for school after that. Why, try it. I'll make you some cowboy shirts and we'll order a cowboy hat and boots and away you go. So they came and picked me up right in front of the house. First job was in Escanaba, Michigan. And I remember we had to play a radio station that was down an alley, and that's where they pull their wagons in to fill it up with feed. It was a grain farm warehouse. And in there was a radio station. You sit on the bales of hay and everything else, and this guy in the corner had a pair of earphones and a crystal set, and that was the engineer. And he moved the crystal, the little whisker on there, until he got the station good. And he says, I got a good signal, we're going to go. And the announces, and we're on the air. And if the bass player's too loud, they move him more toward the door in the alley. If the clarinet's too loud, why, he goes wanders into the bales of hay. And we're doing our thing, and the engineer comes over to me and he says, what's your name? And I says, Red. And he says, well, Red, would you go outside when you're not playing? He says, go outside and look to your left, and they're going to send a signal up if we're coming in good. And it was a barber shop down the alley, and the guy would take some hair and take it out in the alley and light it. And the smoke would go up, and that meant we're coming in good, right? That was my first job.
God, what year was that?
And this was 1929.
Wow.
And in 1929, maybe it was 28, because 29 I was already in Springfield. So what happened in 28, what happened is that after the first week I got paid. And the guy takes me out by the side of the car and he pays me. And he goes, here it is, 10, 20, 30, 40, right?
You thought it was 10 a week.
By the week. And he's paying me. So here I come up, and he says, here's an extra 10 for you. And he threw in an extra 10 for me. So I got $80 out of that thing.
My God.
And I just was in shock. I just could not believe my eyes and what was happening. The ironic part about it is that when I joined the band, the fellow that was teaching me the guitar, he fired.
Wolverton?
Wolverton. And he hired me. And the whole reason I went with the band is because I would be close to Wolverton. And I felt very bad about it. And at the end of the 3 months, I had to go back to home. When I got back home, the phone rings. And my mother said, Lester, it's for you. And I picked up the phone, and it was Joe Wolverton. And Joe says, I'm in Springfield, Missouri. And he says, Red, how would you like to team up with me, you and I as a team? And I says, hang on, I'll talk to my mom. So I talked to my mom, and I was helping her make the bed. So I'm on one side, toughing the pillows, and she's German, so it had to be just right. Everything, just right. And so she said, well, Lester, do you want to do that? And what about your school? And I says, I don't think the school's important. Now, I had 1/2 year to finish school. So I was way ahead of my class, and I'd skipped a couple grades, and so they were talking about holding me back and everything else because I was whizzing through. So I said, Joe, Mother okayed it. And Mother got on the Greyhound bus with me and took me to Springfield, Missouri, turned around and went back on the next bus, and I stayed in Springfield, Missouri, never to come back home again.
Wow. And then,
at 13.
generally speaking then, from 1929, 28, 29, till you appeared on records in the late 40s, early 50s.
Oh no, I appeared in 19, I can't find the records. There's 112 transcriptions made for Jack Cap in 1930.
As Les Paul?
No, as Rhubarb Red, Sonny Joe and Rhubarb Red. Those are the names we used. We had worked our way from Springfield, Missouri to KMOX in St. Louis, from St. Louis to Chicago. In Chicago, Joe and I apiece made $2,500 a week.
Wow. How come? Doing what?
We're doing radio. We were on CBS. CBS. We were on NBC. We were on WLS. Out of Chicago alone, we were on 4 stations. And we were making, like I say, $2,500 a week. Plus I was working with Ben Burney. Plus I was working with at the big Yank work shirt company from the World's Fair. By 1933, we were the biggest thing in Chicago, making more money than anybody ever dreamt of in Chicago. Now you figure this is in the Depression. And my brother was making somewhere between $9 and $18 a week driving a truck. And I'm making $2,500
What was
every
happening
week.
to you? Were you living crazy?
I lived crazy as hell. I spent every dime either buying my mother's stuff, buying the girls' stuff. I was playing for Capone. I was now in Chicago. I now was approached with a decision. I had become now such a guitar player that I was equal to Joe Overton, if not beyond Joe Overton. I'd learned everything from Joe and the associates around us. I had studied very hard. And by 1933, I had to make a decision. I'm now working with Eddie South, the Dark Angel of the violin, playing jazz. I'm now working with Louis Armstrong. I am now working with Teddy Wilson. Shortly, within the year, I was working with Art Tatum, with Earl Hines. I was working with Roy Eldridge. And this is at night. And then I use the name Les Paul. In the daytime, making all this money, I was Rhubarb Red.
On radio.
Yeah, changed my name from Red Hot Red to Rhubarb Red back in St. Louis. From that point on, I was 2 people. In the morning, at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, howdy, this is Rhubarb Red, and I did my hillbilly. And I still do it at Fat Tuesdays. Every Monday night I'll break into a country song and do that, because someone asked me what my first hit song was. And I'll say, well, the first #1 hit record I ever had was Just Because. And it was on Montgomery Ward for Champion Records. And I said it was a big hit in Deep Elm Blues. And you know, within 2 weeks, I was sent a copy, a tape of the record found in L.A. in MCA's warehouse.
No kidding.
And the contract. They zapped a picture of the contract and my sheet music. They sent me the whole thing.
No kidding.
Via some guy asking me that question at Fat Tuesdays. I says, well, the first was 112 transcriptions I haven't found yet, made vertical, which were made in 1931 at the Daily News Building in Chicago. The second record was made in 1936 as Rhubarb Red, and then I struck out for New York, never to use the name Rhubarb Red again.
And what happened after that? I mean, you were no longer Rhubarb Red, you were Les Paul, but did you continue to be Powerhouse?
I I quit my job as Rhubarb Red. And when I did, the Atlas brothers, who owned Chicago, Ralph and Les Atlas, they pleaded with me not to do it. And I says, I want to play jazz. And I'm not going to be a guitar player, I'm going to be a piano player. So in 1933, I quit. And from 1933 to 1934, I played jazz piano for Ralph Gleason, Jackie Gleason. And I had the trio and the group that played for him while he was learning to become a comedian. I was learning to be a jazz player. Now I had the guitar hanging there, and I would stroll with the guitar and sing my hillbilly songs and whatever. Saxophone player would come out, and we'd play all the jazz songs. So now I am converting over from Rhubarb Red to Les Paul. By 1934, Ralph Atlas is walking on the north side of Chicago, and that's where he lived. And Ralph saw my picture in this saloon called the Ball of Fire. And he calls me on the telephone, says, Red, I want to talk to you. And I went to see him, and he says, how are you doing? And I said, I couldn't do better. I lied. I was making $5 a week, sleeping above the nightclub, playing jazz. And he says, why don't you come to work for me? Ralph said. I said, okay. So he says, I'll give you $45 a week. And I went to work for Ralph.
As what?
As a staff guitarist. Okay. Now I was working, making $2,500 at WBBM and WGN, WLS and everything. Dropped down to $5 playing the piano and found out I wasn't going to be a piano player. Now out comes Art Tatum. And he comes to Chicago, and I hear Art Tatum, and I said, boy, I quit just in time. Just in time. So in 34, I went to work for Ralph Atlas. And in 1936, I go to Ralph Atlas, and I said, Ralph, I'm leaving. And he says, where are you going? I says, I'm heading for New York with a trio. And he says, well, what are you going to do? Who are you going with? I says, I'm going with Paul Whiteman. I'd seen Paul Whiteman on the stage. I'd seen Ella Fitzgerald and Chick Webb. I'd seen these people on the stage, but I never met Paul Whiteman. He just asked me a name, who I was going with, and I just picked a name out of my head. So I says, Paul Whiteman. So the two guys in my trio had been rehearsing for 2 years at JJD in Chicago to swing over to Les Paul and his trio. And I formed this trio, Les Paul Trio. And we packed the car. And Johnny Johnson, the Hoosier Hotshots, Red Foley, they were all there to help put the stuff on the roof and everything else and wave goodbye to us. And we were on our way to New York. Oh, I flipped a coin whether we were going to go to L.A. or New York. And it landed New York, and so we worked our way to New York, playing all kinds of jobs with Red Foley and with some of the others on the way to New York. When we got to New York, we were broke. We just had a few dollars. And if I'd have saved my money, I'd have been rich. But I hadn't, and so we're at the Chesterfield Hotel of all places, and that happens to be the place to be if you're a musician. And the first day we're there, we're at 42nd Street. So I walked into the first club, which was the Onyx Club, And he says, well, go get your instruments. It was Carl Kress, a very famous guitar player. And he listened to us, and he says, you got the job. The first night in New York. Art Tatum is next door. It seemed like all Chicago was in New York. Roy Eldridge and Slim and Slam Stewart, just everybody you wanted, Mildred Bailey and on, Count Basie, and you just name it, and they were all there. We, within 3 or 4 days, the other two fellows in the trio said to me, well, you're going to call your friend Paul Whiteman. I don't know Paul Whiteman. So I said, I'll have to look his number up in the book. So I looked it up in the book, and his office number was 53rd and Broadway. So when I called, they said, we're not interested. The girl at the desk says, unless you make an appointment, we're really not interested. And I know, speaking for Paul, that he has plenty of people not looking for anybody. And they hung up. So my two guys says, what did they say? And I said, come on right over. So I said, pack up the stuff and we'll go over there. And we didn't even have cases, you know. So we went over there to 53rd and Broadway. And we go up to the top floor, and it's Paul Whiteman. And I see him in the hall. From getting out of the elevator, you can look right all the way to one of the other doors between us. So the two guys said, thought you knew Paul. And I said, well, he just probably didn't recognize me being that far away. So who comes out of the door by the elevator but Fred Waring? And I says, geez, that's Fred Waring. So I walked over to Fred Waring, and I says, you're Fred Waring. He said, yeah. He said, what's your name? And I started to say Rhubarb Red, and I said Les Paul. And I says, could we play for you? And he says, I got 62 Pennsylvanians I can't feed right now. And I says, well, the elevator's down the basement. Can we play till it gets here? He says, I don't think I can stop you. And so we took our instruments and we played for him. And he says, get in the elevator. Now, he was up at Whiteman's to use the bathroom because his was being repainted. He had an enormous, the whole floor underneath Whiteman, where he rehearsed his 62 Pennsylvanians. And they had, at that time, the Ford hour. Okay. So he stopped the band and the Glee Club, and he says, something very strange has happened to me, but these 3 kids here stopped me in the hallway while I was taking a leak upstairs. And he said, they played for me. And he says, if you like them as much as I do, I'm going to hire them. So I said to the 2 guys, I said, we got the job. And we only knew 2 songs, by the way. Okay. So we had After You've Gone and one other one that I can't even remember now, something like Casey Jones. We did the number, and they all applauded, and we got the job. And then I told Fred we didn't belong to the union. And so Fred, he got us into the union. And of course, from Fred Waring on, it went up. So in 1939, a big thing happened. Fred Waring had formed an anti-recording deal with Tommy Dorsey, Paul Whiteman, Jimmy Dorsey, everybody, many of the people not to record, that it was going to ruin the business for the entertainer. I didn't agree with Fred. And so in 1939, I went to Fred, and I said, Fred, we want to record. We don't care what your thoughts are about this thing. We want to make a record. He says, I refuse to let you make a record. Well, and I'm leaving. So you have a contract. I says, to hell with the contract. You can't make us play. I'll play, but it won't be good. But you got to let us make those records. So he says, okay, go ahead and make your record. So I did. I made a deal with OK Records. And we did 4 sides, Out of Nowhere, Swanee River, Where Is Love, and whatever. And it got a review in Billboard saying that we were candidates to make one day become a big act in the record business. And the record reviews were very good. That was in '39. Now I knew by '39 I'd been living in Harlem. I lived in Jackson Heights, but I spent most of my lifetime from 1936 to 1941 in Harlem, playing with Lester Young and Chu Berry and everybody. And that's where I met Jerry Wexler. But that's where I met everybody. Because I'm playing now with Art Tatum every night. I'm playing with everybody, from 1936 on, with my electric guitar and the whole thing. And now there is no more Rhubarb Red. And of course, Lester Young and I were 2 that would get caught, I guess, the most. And we'd end up before the union. And Fred would squash the union deal, and he'd say, let him go, and they'd let me go. But it was $1,000 in those days if you were caught jamming. And they couldn't find Lester Young because he didn't have any money, so they took his horn away from him. So the union literally took Lester Young's horn away from him. Now, Dizzy Gillespie was just coming in. He was just a kid sleeping in the park. And anybody you want to name was there. Up in Harlem, that was the nest. That's where everything grew.
And you were a peer of all those people.
I was absolutely at the beginning of the jazz world.
Who else was around? Charlie Christian was around?
Well, Charlie Christian, I took a vacation in 1937. I went back to Waukesha on my vacation. And my mother, now I'm with Fred Waring, we're on 5 nights a week. At 7 o'clock and 11 o'clock. 7 for the East Coast and 11 for the West Coast. Okay. And my mother, I expected her to be just absolutely overwhelmed. And when I got to Waukesha, she says, why don't you leave that band, Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians, and go with a good band? And I says, Mother, Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians 5 nights a week on NBC, and I'm featured twice a week as Les Paul and his trio. And then the other times I'm in the band playing, 16 bars of this and that. I says, this is heaven. And we're making $300 a week. And she says, no, Lester, there's a band out in Tulsa. Tomorrow night I'll show you what you should be doing. And she tunes in, and here we are listening to this with Texas, with Bob Wills and his Texas Cowboys. Right? She says, that's where you belong. So I'm intrigued, because Mother usually doesn't say something unless it means something, and there must be something behind all this. Now, this was a Western swing band. So I said to my bass player, he was on vacation with us, you want to take a ride out to Oklahoma? So we went out to Oklahoma and sat in with Bob Wilson's Texas Cowboys. And afterwards, we were at a little beer joint. And in this beer joint, it was dry out there at that time. And it was dry last time I was in Oklahoma. It's been dry for a long time. Well, anyway, at that time, a little kid, little skinny colored boy, looked up at me and he says, Mr. Paul, I really like your music and your playing and everything else. Is there any chance that I could sit in and play your guitar? And I says, can you play this thing? Yeah. He said, I can play it. It was Charlie Christian.
Wow.
Okay. And that was in 37.
And later did he appear in New York?
And later he came to New York. When he came to New York, he looked me up right away and he says, John Hammond brought me there with Benny Goodman, for Benny Goodman and everything else. So he says, where do I get a guitar like that? And I says, we'll order a new pair together. I'll get you with Gibson. And so the Charlie Christian pickup was born and the Charlie Christian was born. And of course, he only lived for a few years after that. And he died over in Staten Island, and he was in the hospital, and I got an electric shock, and I was in the hospital at the same time. We used to call each other. How you doing, Charlie? How you doing, Les?
When did you leave Waring?
At 41.
41, and then what happened?
Well,
military service?
I was heading for Bing Crosby, and Bing had never heard of me, just like Whiteman. And you asked me early in this interview, did I know where I was going? Yeah. I knew exactly where I was going. And I'm leading right up to Capitol Records.
Sure.
Okay. So I said I'm going with Bing Crosby. I got in Chicago, and the Atlas Brothers says, look, we'll make you a musical director, and we'll put you with Ben Burney, and you got the run of the place, and we'll give you $1,000 a week. And I says, I really don't want that. I want to go with Bing. Well, try it. So I says, what does it entail? He says, your name on the door. The secretary runs it, and you don't have to do a damn thing. You're just musical director of the station. Okay? So I says, well, I can't lose on that. And then the rest is extra money with Ben Burney, which is some $500 more. And whatever it is. So I'm making almost $2,000, damn near as much as I made 10 years prior to that in Chicago. But I'm totally convinced not to go back to country and western music. Not to go that direction. I'm on my way to Bing Crosby. So I'm with Ben Burney, and Ben Burney says, where in the world did you come from? And I said, I was with Fred Waring. I'm on my way west. And he says, well, I live in California. He says, I'm not feeling well. Would you like to take my band over and become Les Paul, all right, and the lads? And you take my music, you take my arrangers, I'll teach you everything. And I'm going to retire. And he says, in the meantime, I'll give you $75 a week when you're not working. Okay? But he says, you can go to work right away. He says, you're a natural to take over this band. Ben Burney became ill. And by train, he went to California. I drove to California with a trio and said, okay, we're going with Bing Crosby. When we got to California, we spotted where NBC, by the way, I was just out there at that corner,
yeah,
and gave a speech down in the basement, is all the equipment from RCA. I don't know if you know that. Under the bank building?
Oh, yes, yes.
You know about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's not under it, but it's just...
Yeah, it's right there.
It's right there. So, what happened is that I parked in the parking lot, and I saw where Bing Crosby come in on Thursday. And I said, this is perfect. Now we got to get in NBC. And so I figured out what time they broke. And when everybody was breaking to come out for a break to get something to eat or drink, we'd back in. And so we actually backed in when everybody was coming out. And the guard says, "Hold it, where are you guys going?" And the bass player yells, "We forgot the music." Now he's pushed his way in. I'm on the outside, backing up the rear to make sure the other two guys get in. I had piano, bass, and guitar. We are now in NBC. We walk down the hallway and we're looking at all the things that we'd never seen. We'd never been in there. And finally I see a studio, and it says F. And I says, "Let's look in there and see if anything's going on in there." Nothing was in there. So the lights were on. Here's a big studio. Not as big as the ones I was to see a little later. But it's right across from where Bing was. Bing was in B. And F was right across the hall from him. So we go in there, and I says, plug my amplifier in, get the music out, and start to play. And we did. And he says, piano player says, "Why in the world are we sitting here practicing?" I says, "Just let me handle it." So the door opens, and in walks a little guy. Never forget it. He had little wire glasses on hanging way down at the end of his nose. And he stands there and he listens to us play, and we're playing Back Home Again in Indiana as fast as we can play it. And as good as we can do it. And he says, "Boy, you guys are good." He says, "I don't find you down here on the sheet." And I says, "My name is Les Paul." And he says, "Well, I'm Billy Gelcher." He says, "I'm the contractor here, musical contractor for the station." But he says, "I don't see you listed." "The Les Paul Trio." "Yeah, Les Paul Trio." "Well," he says, "you sure you're in the right place?" "Oh," I says, "we're in the right place, all right, Bill, but," I says, "I got to talk to you." So I explained to him what we did, that we backed him, and he laughed. And he says, "This is the damnedest thing I ever heard." He says, "Let me call the musical director." So he gets Tom Peluso, the musical director of NBC in Hollywood. So Tom comes in and he listens and he says, "My God," he says, "you guys are really good." He says, "You got a job." In the meantime, he calls Sid Strotz. And Sid is an old buddy of mine from NBC in Chicago. He knows me as Rhubarb Red. In fact, he was the instigator to bring me from KMOX to Chicago, and from Chicago, not to New York, but to Chicago, and now L.A. So Sid Strotz is standing there, and he says, "Les, how are you?" Big, tall, handsome guy, and I throw my arms around. He calls me Red. Well, Sid's dead now. So Sid says, "What in the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "We're looking for a job." And he says, "Jesus Christ, why didn't you come to me? You got it." I says, "We already got the job." So NBC gave us 19 shows a week. All right. So now at NBC, I asked the girl that authorizes what room we rehearse in, I says, "I want Studio E, emergency." She says, "Nobody uses that studio." But I says, "That's the studio we want to rehearse in." And she says, "Well, it's terribly small. There's just a piano and a cot to lay down, and this is in case of an air raid. This is the worst place to be in the whole world," right? I got more tapes. And so we got Studio E. And I'd already cased out that on Thursday, for some reason or another, Bing went into Studio E. He walked down the hallway and disappeared in Studio E. So we put the music up, and I know what time he comes in. At 4:25, Bing walks in. And so we're playing Back Home Again in Indiana, and the door opens. And I told the piano player and the bass player, if somebody walks in, don't stop playing. And the piano player was in shock when he saw Bing. and he stopped playing. And so I says, keep playing. So we went back to playing again, and Bing listened for a couple of seconds, and he says, oh, excuse me. He says, I didn't know that anybody was in here. So he went out, and the piano player says, Joe Rand says, that was Bing Crosby. I says, I know it, keep playing. So we kept playing, and the door opened again. And Bing come back in. And he says, do you mind? And I said, not at all, Bing. And so Bing leaned over and he says, what do you call this group? I says, the Les Paul Trio. And he says, you're Les Paul, huh? I said, that's right. He says, where are you working? I says, we got a job here at NBC. He says, not anymore. He says, from now on, starting Thursday, you're with me.
Wow.
Right? So he turns around, walks out of Studio E, and I run to the door and I open it, and I says, hey, Bing. And he says, yes, Les. I says, how much? He says, 1,000. Said, okay. Said, hey, Bing. He says, yes, Les. I says, how much for the other guys? So he says, I'll talk to Trotter, we'll put him in the band. We'll put him in the band.
Isn't that amazing?
Isn't that an amazing?
And then you stayed with Bing?
I stayed with Bing, went into the service. They heard me with Bing. And Meredith Willson came to me and he says, hey, if you're ever inducted, and I says, I'm already inducted. I says, I've got my notice. I'm already called for. And he says, well, I'd like to have you with an organization we're forming called the Armed Force Radio Service. And he said, it isn't started yet. There's Colonel Lewis, and he's Captain Meredith Willson. And he says, I would love to have you. And I says, well, you got me. And he says, well, then I don't want anybody else to get you. So he says, I don't want you to go in the Signal Corps, so don't be too smart when you're inducted. Okay. And I said, well, I've got a problem. I says, Orrin Tucker wants me, Glenn Miller wants me, Wayne King wants me. So I named all the guys. Eddie Peabody wants me at the Great Lakes. I says, I've already called them, and they're all requesting me, so I'm going to go with Glenn Miller. I'm going to go with somebody, one of those bands. And I says, I'd much rather stay here. Now, the Armed Force Radio Service, I was living on Gordon Street. And on Gordon Street in Santa Monica is the Armed Force Radio Service. On the very street that I live on. You talk about. Well, anyway, Meredith made arrangements. It's a long story, and it's a great one for my book. Okay, yeah, and it tells just how I got with Meredith Willson. So being with Meredith Willson, my job with Meredith was not only to play in his band, but to have the Les Paul Trio, and to pick the artists that are going to appear on the different shows. So he says, you seem to know everybody, Les, and when it comes to the music, we're going to leave that up to you, Les. And so one of my jobs was to find Roy Eldridge and Art Tatum and Count Basie and bring them in for Jubilee, to bring them in for Command Performance, to bring them in for Mail Call. In the meantime, I played for everybody in the armed forces. So I was given a phone book with everybody's name in it. So if I wanted Art Tatum, I looked under Art Tatum. But if I wanted Groucho Marx, I got Groucho. I had the phone book for everybody known to man. It's around here somewhere.
That last couple of years or something like that?
Huh?
That lasted a year or two?
That lasted for 2 years and some 3 months that I was in the armed forces. But while I was in the armed forces, I'm now playing for Bing, for everybody else. And I've got the best job that you could ever dream of, because I'm just now in a position to know everybody. So when I do get out of the service, I'm in a tremendous position. Now in the armed forces, I probably made more records than anybody in the armed forces. Because not only did I do my stuff alone for my trio for the armed forces, but I was doing it with Jubilee, I was doing it with Mail Call, I was doing Command Performance, and on all these shows, I would be featured. So I was hitting the whole world during the war. So anyway, when I got out, I went back with Bing Crosby. I was working with Johnny Mercer. I was working with Frank Duvall. I was doing the 5 top shows out of LA. And along come Norman Granz. And by now I've built a recording studio in my backyard at Curson and Sunset. And I've put in the equipment that I thought that would be necessary to make a good record. I had just finished making a record with Bing Crosby called It's Been a Long, Long Time. And it was a hit. And when we made the record, Bing and I went next door to the Grotto. And we were having a beer and a salami sandwich for breakfast. And it was about 8:30 in the morning. Bing said to me, "How'd you like that date?" And I said, "It's all right." He says, "I noticed that when the cap asked inside what you thought of it, what I thought of it, I said it was fine." Bing's saying this. But he says, "You didn't answer." And he says, "I saw that you acted like it could have been better." And I says, "Bing, it could have been a lot better." I says, they're recording with a nail and some sawdust here. I says, they don't know what they're doing. They really don't. And he says, "Get in the car." And we drove up Sunset Boulevard, and he says, "You pick the place you want, and I'll build you a studio. The Les Paul House of Sound. How's that?" And as we drove around, he gets right up to where I live. And I said, "Bing, really I only want to play the guitar." But he says, "You know electronics." By now I've built his whole sound system in his home, Bing's home. Also for Kay Kaiser, also for Ginny Sims, also for Andre Previn. So not only did I know everybody, but I'm deep into electronics and everything else. And by this time, I'd made up my mind, and I said to Bing, "I don't want to build a recording studio. Thanks a lot, Bing, but I'm going to just hang in there and play the guitar." So I says, "Okay." So we went back to Melrose in the parking lot across the street from the Grotto. And I came home, and my 2 friends were waiting there in the backyard on the swing. And what happened, Les? I said, "Oh, we made a record." I said, "It'll probably be a hit with Bing's name on it." You know, and Long, Long Time was a big hit. And I says, "Bing spent a couple hours trying to find a studio, a place to build a studio for me." He said, "Why in the hell didn't you take it?" And I said, "Nah, I don't want to get involved in that." And my 2 friends, Lloyd and Vern, says, "Well, you know what you could do? You could build one right here. Just take this garage right here and turn it into a studio, and you could do practically anything you wanted in this small way." So I said, "What do you think it would cost?" So my one friend, Lloyd, he says, "Well, I can do all the building." So he says, "How are you with a saw, Les?" I said, "I'm good. I can do all that." He says, "Well, the parts and everything else, counting the nails," and he counted it out to the last nail, the last board, and the last bucket of paint, cost $165. So I said, "Vern, what's it going to cost for the electronics?" And Vern says, "Well, to build a recording lathe, we're going to build a recording lathe now. And to do the whole thing, let's say the studio, everything should cost you $665. I says, "Let's go." And we started. And we built that studio in the garage. And out of that studio came, I don't know how many artists that went with Capitol. And at that time, I wasn't with Capitol yet, but at that time, Capitol Records was above Glenn Wallach's, Wallach's music store, upstairs. Now this is 45, and I'm now doing very well. I've done Jazz at the Philharmonic, which was a big, big hit. That very first record ever. Okay. So not only was I the first to do TV out of New York, but I was in 1939, but I was the first one to do a live performance, a jazz performance from the stage. They'd never done that before. Norman Graves was the first to do that. I was the only white guy in the act, and I was the only fellow in the armed forces to play with at that time. I had to wear a uniform. Meredith would not let me take my uniform off, but he let me play the date, which turned out to be very successful. Back to the story. We built the studio, and out of the studio came Judy Canova, was the very first record ever made in that backyard. And then a little guy named Freddie Stewart, who went with Capitol. Then Herb Jeffries, of course the Andrews Sisters, Bing Crosby, Gene Austin,
Recorded in this $800.
Pee Wee Hunt, Calvin Jackson, Andre Previn, everything out of this little garage. Okay. Years later, Jim Conklin said to me, he says, you know, it took us a couple of years to figure out at Capitol Records that when we got a record that was made in your backyard, we signed up the act, and we were signing up the sound, not the act. And he says, you got such great sound, and you had a way of making these guys, bringing the best out of the guys. He says, we took that same artist, put him in our studio in radio recorders, and did it for Capitol, and then we dropped him. And he says, Jim Conklin will tell you this. I'm sure you interviewed Jim. Well, Jim said it took about 2 years before we figured out where was that recorded. That guy sounds good, you know. Okay, so we had the Peggy Lees, we had everybody in the backyard.
And how about your own career at this point?
My own?
A couple of years later, you met Mary. And,
that's right. Mary started, I lifted her through the window in the backyard.
And what was she? Was she a singer?
She was a singer at KNX on a barn dance. And I was looking for, I forgot to mention this, but when I was with Bing, I also kept my 19 shows on NBC.
Oh boy, local shows with them?
No, they were network shows. Sustainers. But I kept them there because it kept us doing a place to rehearse and a place to listen to what we were doing. So that when we did it for Bing, and nobody knew it, it went to Kalamazoo, it went to Terre Haute, Indiana, it went to Albuquerque, New Mexico, went to whatever.
Yeah.
Wanted sustainers, yeah. And so consequently from that studio and meeting Mary, her name was Colleen Summers, I decided to leave Bing and to go out on my own. And all the agencies could tell me, is that I must leave California and go east because that's where it's happening. And they were right. It was not happening in the west, it was happening in the east. And so I said, okay. And so I got a job with the Andrews Sisters to go on tour with Lou Levy. And so that got me into the Paramount Theater. Now, I'd played with Fred Waring at the Strand Theater, the Capitol Theater. I'd played a lot of theaters. I had a lot of training. But I didn't have the training like I felt I needed and wanted, and that was just to get out on my own now, because I could see I could go no farther with Bing. That was the tops. You do Thursday night with Bing, you do a number, and that's it. And the same with anybody else. I was with George Burns and Gracie Allen, right in the middle of their show. They'd say, here now this is Meredith Wilson's orchestra featuring Les Paul. And I would do a number. And for that minute and a half with Burns and Allen was just something where I could go to the bathroom if you wished, or make a sandwich, and then come back and listen to the radio. So I found that I had to go east. And so I did. And when I went east, I found that that's where the shows were, that's where everything was. Garraway was in Chicago. The shows in New York were just beginning, as you know, in the mid-40s to the 50s. New York was on its last leg, so to speak, but it was big. It was big. And so when I came to New York, the breaks started to happen. And I had made a record of Blue Skies, Begin the Begin, and it was a half a hit. It's what Jack Cap called a bass hit. When I joined Decca in 1945, Jack Cap said to me, I'm not looking for a home run hitter, I'm looking for a base hitter. And I says, well, you want to run that by me once more? And he says, Perry Como is a base hitter, not a home run hitter, a base hitter. But he says, I'd rather have Perry Como on my team. I like Dick, he got Dick Hames.
Yeah.
Okay. He was interested in Peggy Lee, a base hit. He was interested in base hits. He was in a lot of base hits. He had the home run hitters. He needed in base hitters.
Yeah.
And the base hitters, he says, if they sell 250,000, he says, I'm happy. So I want the Carmen Cavalleros, I want the Les Pauls, I want the base hitters to fill this up. That's what I want. And so with that in mind, I went with Decca Records. And it proved to be very, very successful. Now I come east, and I get Guitar Boogie Woogie and so forth and so on, and they're just bass hits, and they're moving. This gal that I hired auditioned for these country shows followed me from town to town. And when I'm east, she's east. And I'd say to the trio, it was actually a quartet, Les Paul and his trio. I now have Paul Smith playing piano. I have real good musicians, and we're really big time with the group. And I said, you want to peek out that curtain and see if that gal's in the front row or not? Yeah, she's there. She followed me from town to town, from town to town. And this went on for almost 5 years.
Oh.
With,
did you ever talk? Did you
oh
date?
yeah,
Did you-
yeah. I talked to her, and we'd get together and everything. But I was married
Oh, I see. Yeah.
and didn't want to get too involved. And she followed me and followed me and followed me. If I was in Boston, she was in Boston. If I was in Chicago, she was in Chicago. Finally, it got to the point, well, it got serious. But Mary and I called her Mary. I named her Mary way back in California in 1945 as Mary Lou on one of the Sustainers, the Hillbilly shows. And I did 9 Rhubarb Red shows just for fun of it, just for the fun of it. Because they didn't want any more Les Paul Trio. 19 shows were too many. So 9 of them were Rhubarb Red and the Ozark Apple Knockers, and I did those. What happened is that Mary and I were going pretty steady now, and I said, I've got to do something with my quartet. I found it's not going to make it as an instrumental group alone. It's got to have a vocal. And so it was a choice of Ed Ames, Rosemary Clooney, or Doris Day. Oh, there was a fourth one, K-Star. So I had all 4 of them. And I recorded K-Star and took her to Capitol, to 4 or 5 other record companies. They all turned it down. Clooney was working with Tony Pastor, and we were on the same bill together at the Paramount. Doris Day was there, and I decided the last minute to turn her down and not take Doris Day. And so the guy that found her for me was Marty Melcher, who married her. So Marty says, he pleaded with me that I'm making a mistake, I should take her. And I says, nah, I think a gal in the group would just mess us up. I think we're better off to stay this way and then add the trio, add the vocal to it as we go along, whatever vocalist I think I need. Well, it was in 1948 that Mary and I were on our way back to California. And we were in an ice storm, and I had the automobile accident. And she screamed, and of course I went off the bridge. And Mary didn't get hurt, but I did. I got everything broke that could get broken was broken. And consequently, the next year and a half was a hospital for me. And it was in the hospital that I figured many, many things out. One was a synthesizer, okay? And the one was to do the multiples, which were already out, by the way. Before I tipped the car over, I skipped a point, an important point. And that is that in 1947, when I come back off one of my tours with the Andrews Sisters, I was in L.A., and I have a whole fistful of multiple records, a new idea that I created in that garage. I took them to Art Rush at NBC, and he was handling, and he still does, Roy Rogers. And Rush loved me, Art. And Art says, we're going to do something with you. I'm going to make a deal with RCA. He made the deal with RCA, and I sent my man back to New York to sign the deal up in Camden, New Jersey. And he took a super chief, went to Camden, New Jersey, sent a wire back and said he was literally asked to leave.
They didn't leave?
No, what happened is that they were being pestered by a guy I knew named Carling. Carling. He had a magazine, and he was down at RCA in Camden bugging him until the president says next time he comes in, ask him to throw him out. Ask him to leave. So in walked Cliff Carlin.
Oh, God, the wrong guy.
They threw him out.
Ah.
And he says, I've never been so humiliated, I have the telegram, in my life. And I'm coming back. The deal is off. And Rush says, I don't know what the hell happened. So he called Camden, and the president was out. So he says, Les, we'll straighten it out tomorrow. And I says, in the meantime, I'll take my records. And I didn't know what had happened, but I walked out the side entrance of NBC, and I'm looking straight across the street at Wallach's Music Store, and here above the stairway is a canvas painting saying Capitol Records, just stretched across the door. Capitol Records. And I thought, what the hell, I'll go walk over there. And I jaywalked right across the street. And I didn't get arrested. And I walked in and I said, who do I talk to around here? It was about 5 minutes to 5. And she says, do you have an appointment? And I said, no, I don't. And she says, well, you should see Jim Conklin. He would be the most logical man if you have some records. And I says, well, where is he? And she says, well, he's upstairs, but he's busy and without an appointment. I said, okay. So I was about to leave, and I saw all the people leaving. And I says, I think I'll back up the stairs. That's what I did across the street at NBC. That's what I did with Fred Waring, with Whiteman. I just catch him right there. So I backed up the stairway. Nobody said anything. And I walked into the first office. It said Jim Conklin. And I says, are you Jim Conklin? And he says, yep. And he's packing his stuff. He's taking everything and putting it in a briefcase. He was on his way to New York. And I says, my name is Les Paul. He says, the guitar player? I says, yeah. And he says, boy, he says, I sure like your work. I says, well, you sure like this one. I want to play it for you. It's a whole new idea. So Jim says, I can't now. He says, I don't know how to run the phonograph, and I got to catch a plane. And I said, I know how to run a phonograph. You keep packing, Jim. And I said, let me play this for you. He says, okay. So I played it, and it was Lover.
With Mary on it?
No,
This is
Mary.
just a vocal.
No,
This
Mary
is an
isn't in. Mary isn't in this
Yeah,
act
this
yet.
is just an instrumental. Right?
This is an instrumental, Lover. I played the next one, it was Nola. I played the next one, it was Goofus. By now, he's not ready to leave at all. So he calls the gal down. An envelope he wrote, this is to consummate a deal between Les Paul and Capitol Records. The contract's to be drawn up Monday by our lawyers. A 5% deal, so much for records, he can make them in his own home, he can make them anywhere he wishes, at his discretion. And he can choose whatever material he wants to do, da-da-da-da. And in the meantime, I will give him a choice of Gillette. Yeah, I knew Lee from Chicago. And Boyle Gilmore, and on and on and on and on. And he says, you got yourself a deal, Les. I walked down the stairs, and there was Art Rush. They wouldn't let him upstairs. And Art says, I got a hang of RCA. We got the deal. And I says, it's too late. I just made a deal. I just made a deal. Now when I'm driving in Oklahoma City, I went back there to open my dad's nightclub. My dad and brother had a nightclub. They were opening a little tavern, but music once in a while. And to open the nightclub, we opened it up, then I got infectious mononucleosis. I didn't know what I had. And I was lying down in the front seat, and Mary was driving, and we went off the bridge. And now for the next year and a half, I'm in the hospital. And the number one hit on the radio is Lover. And that was the first release that came out in February of '48, and I'm lying in the Wesley Hospital, terribly injured.
Because I see it was 1950 that Nola and Goofus came out.
Well, then they still had Nola and Goofus and those things. I'd given them 22 sides, and those 22 sides were all to be hits.
All multiples.
All multiple.
All done in your garage.
No, they weren't all done in the garage, but many were done in the garage. That one was done in the garage.
And this preceded Patty Page going out and
Oh, this is way before Patty Page.
Sure.
This turned the light on for Patty. This is where the multiple came. This is where it started. Now, not only did the multiple start there, but in the meantime, he invented this reverb, the echo. And I said, by putting a playback cartridge behind the record head, I now can get hey, 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 hey. And now I can record at half speed, variable speeds, and so forth and so on. And I was already making 27 generations of multiples. And I was deep into all of this. And Crosby was there listening to this. Now, Bing would be over at the house all the time listening to this. He's saying, they're going to blow the world apart. Decca turned it down. Dave Kapp said, I think it might be all right as a novelty, but I don't think it'll ever make it. And I said, well, you're not the guy I'm looking for. So I went to RCA with Art Rush, walked across the street to Capitol, tipped a car over. Capitol released the record of Lover. And of course, I couldn't make anything else because I'm in the hospital. Now, until this right arm, they cut the cast off and it's fixed in this position, then I go back to playing again. So I had to finish things like Caravan, Brazil, with my arm like this in a post. There's a post right here.
Ooh.
Now, the only thing it could move was this thumb. So I put a thumb pick on it and I laid the guitar this way. And so the lead part of anything after Lover was made with just a thumb pick and my finger in a cast. And I have a picture of it.
Yeah.
And Jim Conklin, I showed it to Jim, so.
When did you get the idea to put Mary and do these multiples with vocals?
All right. Now, with Mary, the idea happened in 48. Okay. And lying in the hospital there, I said, I know what to do. I know what to do. When I get out, this is what I'm going to do. So when I got out, I started with Mary. And when I made the records with Mary, singing on what I thought was going to be my next release, Jim Conklin said, quote, she has a plaintive, folksy, Wisconsin dairymaid voice. She's good. But I'm married to one of the King sisters, and she's good. But Les, I think you'd be better off to just stay the way you are. So if you look at the records with Mary, with Capitol Records, the originals say the Les Paul and his new sound. It says nothing about Mary except vocal by Mary.
Until when?
Until I went to Capitol Records in 1950, and How High the Moon Is Out, Les Paul, and it just says vocal by Mary Ford. And Ford came out of a phone book.
Okay.
Yeah. I just looked, I says, I want a rich name for you, Mary, and a short name.
Success was instant with
Instant.
High the Moon.
Instant.
What effect because even with all the success you had had before, Waring, with Crosby, playing, it had never had this kind of range
never.
for you. I mean,
No.
that's, when I said, where did it all come from, frankly, now I remember you as a guitar player when I was
Prior.
a kid, with bands, but you really burst out there.
Yeah.
Now, what effect did that have on you? I mean, any at all? All of a sudden, now you're a real star.
Well, I'll tell you, Mary and I, after my accident, decided to form a group. And she's going to play rhythm guitar in the group and sing. So it's Les Paul Trio and the voice of Mary Ford. Okay? Excuse me, at that time it wasn't even Mary Ford. It was Colleen Summers. It wasn't even Mary Ford then yet. And so we went to, we went on tour to open at the Blue Note in Chicago. And having Mary in a street dress and me dressed like I am now, and the Relief Band in tuxedos didn't go over very well as far as the owner was. And so Frank Holstein, who owned the Blue Note, opening night fired us with the new Les Paul Trio with Mary in it. And he says, the gal with the house dress on and you with moccasins on, and this whole thing has got to go. And so opening night, we were reviewed by all the papers in Chicago, including the Downbeat, including Metronome, and including Billboard, including Variety, and the Tribune, whatever. And we were given notice, and they were going to bring in George Shearing to take our place. And he called, and I listened to him call, and he just says, "This is for the birds. This group gotta go." The people reviewed the show. I guess it was on a Tuesday night that they reviewed the show. They hit the papers on Thursday, I think it was, a couple of days later. We were a hit. I didn't see the reviews, and I went out and got Mary a dress, and I got a tuxedo, and the bass player got a tuxedo, and I saw the marquee out there when I went to the Blue Note, and it said, "The world's greatest guitarist." He took the old marquee down and put up a whole new thing because he'd read the reviews, and the reviews were like 100% raves.
And this is before the records, before the multiple
no,
records?
this Lover was out.
Well, Lovers, but before How High the Moon, and before she
Oh, it's
was...
before How High the
Yeah,
Moon.
yeah,
Yeah. Now I had How High the Moon. Now here's what happened, and this is what's so interesting. I didn't have. This is where How High the Moon started. Holstein says, "Forget the tuxedo, forget the dress, and do just what you're doing. I cancel Shearing, and you can stay here for 6 months if you want to." The whole world changed with those reviews, and we were on our way. Now I want to do something with Mary. So of all things, and I forgot to tell you this, I still kept the shows.
The 19 shows.
9 of the 19 shows I kept. But not the Hillbilly shows. I kept 9 shows. Okay. And this show, I had to give to NBC so that they could broadcast it. And it came out at KFI. It came out at KFI in Los Angeles. And the show was very popular. And it was the talk of the industry out there, because we didn't hear it back here. Now Mary and I leave the Blue Note in Chicago to come to Bop City in New York to be with Louis Armstrong, on the bill with Louis Armstrong. The night we landed in New York, they closed. So Mary and I are in New York, and I sent the bass player off because there's no use having a bass player if we're not working and we're broke. So he went back to Chicago, and I said, Mary, let's stay in New York and find a place to record, because we have to do these radio shows. And so I put Mary on the radio shows, and I came up with a new idea for the radio shows. And in the basement in Jackson Heights, $40 a month is what I paid for a basement. Had no phone, no radio. The number one song on the air, and I never knew it, was Nola. A big hit. And I get a telegram from Jim Conklin, congratulations for being number one. And I said, number one in what? I don't have a phone. I don't call Jim. I have no idea that he released Nola, and that I'm number one out there. Now I'm recording with Mary in this basement, and this is there's a little insert here. Guy sitting in the front row at Fat Tuesday says, "What was the very first record you ever made with your Sound on Sound?" And I says, nobody's ever asked that question, but when I go home, I'll look it up. And I dug it out. It's right aside of me here. Number one. The number one reel of tape. The first thing I did with the tape machine was record the NBC show. For the next 19 weeks, I did nothing but radio shows. Now here's the shocker. All the songs from the radio shows were released on Capitol Records as phonograph records.
Including How High the Moon is?
Including all of
Did
them.
them all in Jackson Heights?
All in Jackson. And
All
on
those
the road.
records? I'm Confessing?
You got it.
Oh my God.
You got it.
Just one more.
There's one more chance.
All recorded there, not in the Capitol Studios? No?
No Capitol Studios, not even our garage.
But now, of course, you're famous. Now, of course, you're famous.
Yeah.
And did you start working dates and things like that?
No. We kept making, and Mary'd say, why does it have to be record length? Because I says, I want to send these back to Capitol. These are record length because these are going to be our next releases for Capitol. So they're all from the radio shows. The originals are right here.
My God.
I have 36 shows now that Mary and I do with talking now. There's a lot of dialogue,
Sure.
right? When I'd have to find which show it's on, but I can take the very show that I made, How High the Moon, with Mary. Okay, and I demonstrate how it's made. All on one tape machine.
Isn't that amazing?
Now I invented, in order to leave that studio out there in Hollywood and to get to New York, I had to figure a way of doing that. So here's another insert. So I called Bing, said, hey Bing, can you get me a tape machine? He says, tell me what you want, you got it. So Bing threw it in his car and brought it over to me and gave it to me. When I got the tape machine, I looked at it and said, now how can I go on the road with one tape machine and do all this? With two, you can bop back and forth between them. I'm going to do it all on one. So I figure out in my head how to do sound on sound. By putting a fourth head on there, I can just erase the previous track and I can keep multi-tracking on and do it by sound on sound with four heads. And have my echo and have everything, my reverb, delay. Okay? So Mary and I carried this tape machine in a station wagon with us. So when we ended up in New York, I got the tape machine in Chicago at the Blue Note. Okay? And the guy says, what was the first song that you made? And I said, I remember it very well because the hotel I stayed in was the St. Lawrence, and next door, Wayne King was playing. And I said he had a big hit on Josephine. And Josephine was the first number that I recorded on the sound on sound, the multi-track. Okay? But not the multi-track with one on two. I invented that later.
Yes.
That was invented in 1952.
And that was, and what records came out of that?
Well, I'll get to that. One on multi-track,
Yeah.
Via con Dios. Okay? Via con Dios, when we get to it, has got to be one of the most interesting stories of our career.
Tell me.
Okay. Mary and I, we're now very successful and everything. And we're playing in St. Paul. Terrific snowstorm. Very bad weather. Beautiful weather as far as I'm concerned, because, you know, I should have been an Alaskan husky. It makes no difference to me about snow. And I turn the radio on, and I hear a gal, Anita O'Day. I know who it is. And Anita is singing, Via con Dios, my darling. You know, may God be with you, my love. Boop-a-doop-doop-doo-doo, you know. And she's swinging the hell out of this thing. And I'm listening to it. And I said to Mary, she's sewing her dress on the bed. I says, do you like that song? She said, I don't know what it is. She said, I like it, but I don't know what it is. And I said, I'm going to find out. So I reached for the phone and called the disc jockey. And the jockey at the station said, are you really Les Paul, Mary Ford? If you come over here, you can have the record. So I went over there and got the record. And I said, Mary, we're driving from St. Paul to New Jersey except to stop for gas. So get a lot of junk food because we're on our way. And we went all the way from St. Paul to this hill at the bottom here in New Jersey. And as we're coming up the hill, I hear Dave Garraway, who is my very dear friend. He broke Glover, by the way. He's the guy that launched my career along with Capitol. He loved me very, very much. We were very dear friends. And Dave Garraway announced, he says, we're now going to play the #1 record in the nation. I'm sitting on top of the world. Les Paul, Mary Ford, my very dear friends. I come in the house and I call Garraway and I said, hey Dave, thanks for the plug. I says, and I took Mary and put her right in the studio and we recorded Via con Dios. In the meantime, I rewrote the lyrics. I called Dave and says, the next release, I says, we just finished making, and I says, I can't tell you the name of it for a few weeks, but I says, you'll be hearing it shortly, and I says, I guarantee you, it's a smash. I called Capitol Records, and I got Hal Cook. I says, Hal, stop, I'm a fool to care. And he says, we've already stamped out $500,000. He says, we're already on our way with it. I says, well, stop it. Stop it. Put out Via con Dios. What's the name of it? So Voyle Gilmore gets on the phone. He says, what's the name of that song? Via con Dios? I says, maybe it's Vajas con Dios. I don't know. And Voyle calls me back in 15 minutes. He says, Les, we own that song. It's a dog. It's a dog. He says, Anita O'Day made that thing. He says, forget it. Forget it. I says, I've changed the lyrics. And I says, I'm telling you. Now Mike Gould gets on the phone. And he's telling me, you're wasting your goddamn time. I says, I'm telling you, I'm going to send you nothing but rhythm tracks if you don't do what I tell you to do. Now I says, Glenn gave me carte blanche, and Jim. So I says, you guys do what I'm telling you. So they stopped I'm a Fool to Care. And he says, well, we own it. And if you want to put it out, okay, go put it out. You know. Out comes Via con Dios. And instead of may God be with you, my darling, may God be with you, my love, instead of saying Via con Dios, my darling, may God be with you, my love, I took that out. And I put in Via con Dios, my darling, Via con Dios, my love. Nobody knows what Via con Dios is unless you read on the record, may God go with God, may God be with you, okay? Meaning Via con Dios. We put the record out, and the other side takes off. One I wrote called Johnny is the Boy for Me, and not Via. So I call Capitol. I says, I want to have 7 cities. I want Capitol to chip in, the publishers chip in, and you're the publisher of Via con Dios. And we are on the other side. And I said, I want to go to 7 cities and perform at the warehouse with all the jockeys. I want to sit on the records, Mary and I, and play for them at the warehouse. And I want them to get them to turn that record over because it's not Johnny is the Boy for Me, it's Via con Dios. And my manager is going crazy because we're knocking off our own hit.
Yeah.
And our hit is now #1 as the pick to go #1 by Capitol and everybody, all the jocks. And I'm for Via con Dios. So they agreed. And we went to 7 cities and performed for all the jockeys, hit all the radio stations. And I asked them to turn the record over. And they did. And of course, the rest is history. And Via con Dios became the #1.
Did you guys play many live? I'm speeding this along because I have to get back into town. But
yeah.
Did you play many live dates during these years? And how did you deal with it if you did? How did you?
The first job that Mary and I got was $180 a week. And I had to pay the bass player.
Well, I meant after the success of the record.
Oh, after the
when
success.
people had heard this sound and expected to hear the same thing on stage, did you play many dates?
Oh yeah. Immediately, Mary and I, it become like an overnight hit.
Yeah.
And what we did to cope with the situation of sounding like what was happening on record on the stage, my first idea, which I did, was to put Mary off stage.
Yes, I remember that.
So Mary sang
remember that.
off stage, and that drove everybody crazy. And it was very successful. Then, when the tape came into being,
Played the tape as
which was in being, but I had never used it on the stage, I then said to Mary, we're going to use a tape and run the tape from my guitar, okay, and I'll call this box, which goes back to these shows. In these shows, which I'm pointing to here, are the old NBC radio shows, which go back. That's where they came from. Now, what I call that was the Les Pulverizer,
Yeah.
and that was the black box
Yes.
that I walked out on the stage with and shook up the whole industry with, was this little black box, and actually was controlling the tapes, where I could record right on the stage, add echo, do everything from the stage, so that we could duplicate the sound exactly like the record.
Years later, Les, when you ceased to be making records, was it a shock to realize the impact and the influence of your guitar on so many of these young kids and blues players?
Yeah.
How,
But I expected that too, because way back in the 30s now, way back in the late 20s, just bear with me just briefly, I took a phonograph needle and the cartridge and just put it in the guitar and then turned it up, and I had an electric guitar. And so in 1929, I already was electric with my dad and mother's radio. And so when I joined the Cowboys, I already had an amplified guitar. And being a diehard for the electric guitar, I never left the electric guitar. I just stuck with it and stuck with it and stuck with it. By 41, I was pleading with Gibson to market the electric guitar, a solid body electric guitar. They just thought I was crazy. And so I took a 2x4 and put two wings on the side so it looked like a guitar, and then take the wings off and show them. I'll show you a picture of it. In fact, I'll give you a picture of it. They call it the broomstick with the pickups on it. The character that comes around with the broomstick with the pickups on it. And they laughed at me. But Leo Fender would sit in my backyard and look at it, and his mind was moving. And Bigsby saw this vibrola, and his mind was moving. And he said, this kid's got all kinds of stuff happening in that garage. This is prior now. This is prior to Mary.
prior to making...
This is the multiples.
And later on, all these kid blues players started picking up on these
Yeah.
Les Paul
Yeah.
Gibson
Yeah.
guitars.
In the late 50s, you're talking in the middle 50s and,
And
and
60s.
from there on, sure.
Sure.
60s. By 1952, I'd signed a deal in 51 with Gibson. It came out in 52. From 1952 to 1964, the Les Paul guitar became so big that probably it was the #1 instrument in the whole world. And the president came to me and said, Les, did you ever in your wildest imagination ever think this would happen? And I said, sure. And this is, my honest feeling is that I knew that this is what would have to happen. Because I go back to Fred Waring in the 30s, when I used to receive more mail than Fred did. And Fred came to me one day and says, Les, how come that you get more mail than I do? And I said, Fred, you'll never believe it, but it's as asking me to stop playing the electric. Nobody wanted me to play the electric guitar. The musicians in the band says, why don't you go back to the acoustical instrument? It's better. And I says, no. So I approached Fred Waring and said, Fred, would you help us decide? And he says, it's simple. Let's vote on it. And my trio and Fred Waring sat in his office, and we put 4 votes in the hat, okay? And we just jokingly opened them up, and they all 4 unanimous stay with the electric.
Electric, yeah.
So I said, Fred, why did you vote for the electric? And he says, well, obviously, he says, you can reach more people with it. He says, they in the back row can hear you. And he says, it has so much more dynamics, so much more power. It's different. He says, that's the way to go.
What would be the price of a '50s Les Paul Gibson guitar now?
Well, Les Paul guitar now, maybe anywhere from right now. Right now, it's around $1,000.
That's a new one.
That's a new one.
I mean, but to pick up
The
one of
used ones up to 10,000.
Sure. I mean,
The 52s to the 58s in there. The line of guitars that's coming out for '88 range from $300 to $30. One guitar, $30,000.
and you still design and you still.
I'm designing one now that is going to be the ultra guitar for the elite, like a car. If you want the car and are willing to pay a fortune for it, we're going to give you a gold guitar.
Wow.
The finest guitar ever.
Terrific. I'm going to have to cut this
Yeah.
because I have to be back.